Hello, everyone. Tonight, I want to help you let go of the day and ease into rest. I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, and it means a lot to be part of your nightly routine. So if you haven't already, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It truly helps. Now, close your eyes and let's begin the first story. Steve Kowalski had been hauling freight across the country for 19 years when he encountered something on Interstate 40 through Arizona that still gives him nightmares. It was a scorching July afternoon in 2021, and Steve was pushing hard to make a delivery deadline in Flagstaff. The desert heat was brutal, even with his air conditioning running full blast, and the endless stretch of asphalt seemed to shimmer like water in the distance, creating an almost hypnotic effect as mile after mile of identical landscape rolled past his windshield. Steve first noticed the other truck around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, somewhere between Winslow and Flagstaff. It appeared in his passenger side mirror, a red Peterbilt that looked almost identical to his own rig. At first glance, Steve thought it was just another trucker running a similar route, perhaps someone from the same company or a driver who happened to favor the same truck model. But as the miles passed, something about the truck began to bother him in a way he couldn't quite articulate, like an itch in the back of his mind that wouldn't go away. The red Peterbilt maintained a perfect position alongside Steve's truck, staying just far enough back to remain in his mirror, but never attempting to pass or fall behind. Steve tried speeding up to 70 miles per hour, then slowing down to 60. The other truck matched his speed exactly, maintaining that precise distance like it was connected to Steve's rig by an invisible tether. What made Steve's skin crawl was how eerily similar the trucks were. Both were red Peterbilt 379s from the same model year. Both had identical chrome packages and similar trailer configurations, and even the wear patterns on the other truck's front bumper seemed to match the damage on Steve's own rig from a minor fender bender he'd had 6 months earlier. Steve tried his CB radio to make contact with the other driver, calling out on multiple channels with increasing urgency. Red Pete in the right lane. This is Red Pete in the left lane. You got your ears on. But no response came through the static. He could see the other truck clearly in his mirror, could make out the CB antenna on top of the cab, but couldn't raise the driver on any frequency. It was as if the other truck existed in a parallel dimension where sound couldn't travel. As Steve studied the other truck more carefully, he noticed details that made his hands tighten on the steering wheel. The license plate was obscured by road dust, but he could make out what looked like the same state abbreviation as his own plates. The dot numbers on the cab door were positioned exactly where Steve's were, though he couldn't read them clearly at this distance. It was like looking at a distorted reflection of himself, one that had somehow escaped the mirror and taken on a life of its own. Steve decided to test something that would haunt him for years to come. He signaled for a lane change and moved to the right lane. The other truck immediately moved to the left lane, maintaining the same relative position with mechanical precision. Steve changed back to the left lane, and the other truck mirrored his movement perfectly. It was as if the other driver was anticipating Steve's actions, or somehow knew what he was going to do before he did it. The game of mirror movements continued for over an hour, each maneuver executed with an unsettling synchronization that defied explanation. Around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, Steve pulled into a truck stop in Flagstaff to fuel up and take a mandatory break. As he maneuvered toward the diesel pumps, he watched in his mirrors for the red Peterbilt. The truck followed him into the lot, but didn't stop at the fuel islands. Instead, it parked at the far end of the lot in a spot where Steve could barely see it, but where the driver would have a clear view of Steve's truck. From this distance, he could see that someone was sitting in the driver's seat, but the figure was motionless and appeared to be staring directly at Steve with an intensity that made his skin crawl. When Steve waved, trying to get the driver's attention, there was no response. The figure just sat there, perfectly still, watching with an unwavering gaze that seemed to penetrate right through him. Inside the truck stop, Steve asked the cashier if she'd seen the red Peterbilt that had followed him in. She looked out the window toward the parking lot and shook her head with genuine confusion. "I don't see any red Pete out there except yours," she said, pointing to Steve's truck. Steve insisted there was another truck at the far end of the lot, but when he pointed it out, the cashier looked confused and concerned. "That's just an empty parking space," she said gently, as if speaking to someone who might be having a breakdown. Steve rushed outside and looked toward where he'd seen the other truck, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and disbelief. The parking space was indeed empty, with no tire marks or oil stains to indicate a truck had ever been there. But Steve could have sworn he'd seen it just minutes earlier, could still feel the weight of that unblinking stare. He walked the entire lot, checking every parking space with growing desperation, but found no red Peterbilt other than his own. It was as if the truck had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind only his growing certainty that something impossible had just occurred. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. Ray Martinez was 3 hours into his overnight run from Memphis to Little Rock when he noticed something wrong with the mile markers on Interstate 40. It was 1:30 in the morning on a cold February night in 2022, and Ray had driven this route dozens of times over his 8-year career. He knew every exit, every rest stop, every landmark along the way like the back of his hand. But tonight, something fundamental about the highway had changed in a way that challenged everything he thought he understood about the physical world. Ray first noticed the discrepancy around what should have been mile marker 157, just west of Forest City, Arkansas, according to his GPS and his memory of the route. He should have been passing mile marker 242 heading toward Little Rock, but the green highway sign clearly showed 157, and as Ray continued driving east, the next marker showed 156, then 155. The numbers were counting backward as if he was driving west instead of east, creating a disorienting sense that the highway itself had somehow been reversed while he wasn't looking. Ray checked his GPS again with growing confusion. The screen showed him traveling eastbound on Interstate 40, making normal progress toward his destination. His truck's compass confirmed he was heading east. The sun had set behind him hours ago, and he could see the faint glow of dawn beginning to appear ahead of him on the horizon. Everything indicated he was traveling in the correct direction, except for the mile markers, which continued their impossible countdown with mechanical precision that seemed to mock his understanding of basic geography. Ray tried his CB radio to see if other drivers had noticed the same problem, his voice tight with confusion and growing concern. Eastbound on I-40, anybody else seeing these backwards mile markers? A voice crackled back immediately, another trucker who sounded just as confused as Ray felt. "Yeah, I've been watching them for the last hour," the voice said. "Started around mile 160. My GPS says I'm going the right way, but these signs are telling a different story entirely." The other driver, who identified himself as Big Jim, had been driving for over 20 years and had never encountered anything like this phenomenon. As Ray continued driving through the Missouri countryside, he began to notice other inconsistencies that made his skin crawl with unease. The exit signs were showing familiar town names, but in the wrong order, as if someone had shuffled all the highway signs and put them back in random positions. He passed signs for towns he knew were behind him, mixed with signs for destinations that should have been ahead of him. It was as if the entire highway system had been reorganized by someone with no understanding of basic geography or a deliberate intention to confuse travelers. Around 2:15 in the morning, Ray reached what should have been mile marker 200, but the sign showed 100. That's when he saw something that made his stomach drop with a sickening sense of dread. Coming toward him in the opposite lanes was a truck that looked exactly like his own. Same company colors, same trailer configuration, same model Freightliner, but the driver looked like Ray himself, only older, maybe 10 or 15 years older. The man had Ray's face, but with more gray hair, deeper wrinkles, and an expression of exhaustion that Ray had never seen in his own mirror, as if he'd been driving this same stretch of road for decades without rest. Ray grabbed his CB radio with shaking hands. "Big Jim, you still out there? I just saw something that's got me spooked beyond belief." But when Big Jim responded, his voice sounded different, older, more tired, like someone who had been speaking into the void for far longer than any human should. "Ray, is that you?" the voice said, with a weariness that seemed to echo across impossible distances. "I've been driving this same stretch for God, I don't know how long anymore. The mile markers keep going backward, but I never seem to get anywhere. It's like being trapped in a loop that has no beginning and no end." Ray looked at his GPS with growing horror. According to the screen, he had been driving for 3 hours and had covered 180 miles. But when he checked his odometer, it showed he had only traveled 20 miles since leaving Memphis. The math didn't add up in any way that made sense. Ray had been driving at highway speeds for hours, but his truck's instruments indicated he had barely moved, as if he was driving in place on some kind of cosmic treadmill that consumed time and energy while producing no actual forward motion. Ray decided to take the next exit, hoping to find a way off this impossible stretch of highway. But when he reached the off-ramp, something terrifying happened that challenged his understanding of physical reality. As he drove down the exit ramp, he could see it curving around and merging back onto the same highway he had just left. There was no town, no gas station, no surface streets, just an exit ramp that formed a perfect loop back to Interstate 40. Ray tried the next exit with the same result, and the next, each one leading in a circle back to the highway, creating an endless loop with no way to leave. No escape from the backwards countdown that seemed to be measuring not just distance, but time itself flowing in the wrong direction. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. Jake Sullivan had been through hundreds of way stations during his 14 years of trucking, but the one on Interstate 84 in eastern Oregon would be his last. It was a foggy November morning in 2020 when Jake pulled his fully loaded rig into what appeared to be a routine DOT inspection station. What he discovered there would change everything he thought he knew about the trucking industry and challenge his understanding of what it meant to be human in ways that still haunt him to this day. The way station looked normal enough from the outside, with its standard concrete platform, electronic scales, and small building housing the inspection office. But as Jake drove onto the scale, he noticed something odd that made his skin crawl with unease. The digital display showed his truck's weight at 78,000 pounds, exactly what he expected, but it also displayed a second number that made no sense whatsoever. 847 pounds. Jake's truck and trailer weighed 78,000 pounds loaded. So what was the extra 847 pounds measuring? The number pulsed on the display like a heartbeat, as if it was alive and aware of his confusion. Jake climbed down from his cab and walked toward the inspection office, expecting to find a DOT officer waiting with his paperwork and perhaps an explanation for the mysterious extra weight. Instead, he found the building empty, except for a single desk with a computer terminal that seemed to be displaying information about him that no computer should have been able to access. The screen was showing Jake's truck information, but alongside the normal data, like license plate, DOT number, and cargo manifest, there were additional entries that made Jake's blood run cold with recognition and terror. Under a section labeled Secondary Cargo, the computer listed personal memories at 127 pounds, emotional attachments at 203 pounds, regrets and guilt at 298 pounds, and unfulfilled dreams at 219 pounds. The total psychological weight was 847 pounds, matching exactly what the scale had shown as his excess weight. Jake stared at the screen, trying to process what he was seeing, when he heard footsteps behind him and turned to see a man in a DOT uniform entering the office. The officer looked normal enough, but something about his eyes seemed wrong. They were too bright to knowing, as if he could see things that weren't supposed to be visible to human perception. "Mr. Sullivan," the officer said, consulting a clipboard with an air of professional authority that somehow felt deeply wrong. "We need to discuss your overweight situation. You're carrying 847 pounds of unregistered psychological cargo, and that's a serious violation. You can't operate a commercial vehicle with that kind of emotional overload. It's dangerous to yourself and other drivers who share the road with you." Jake tried to laugh it off, thinking this was some kind of elaborate joke or training exercise. "Come on, officer, you can't weigh emotions. That's not how physics works," he said, but his voice sounded hollow and uncertain even to his own ears. The officer's expression remained serious, almost sympathetic, as if he genuinely felt sorry for Jake's ignorance. "Mr. Sullivan, you've been carrying the weight of your father's death for 12 years. You blame yourself for not being there when he had his heart attack. That guilt weighs 298 pounds, and it affects your driving, makes you distracted and unsafe on the highway." Jake felt his knees go weak as the officer continued, revealing knowledge that should have been impossible for any stranger to possess. "You're also carrying 203 pounds of attachment to your ex-wife, Sarah. You still love her, even though she left you 3 years ago. You keep her picture in your wallet and call her number just to hear her voicemail message. That kind of emotional baggage affects your judgment, makes you take unnecessary risks because part of you doesn't care what happens to you anymore." The officer walked around Jake's truck, running his hands along the trailer as if he could feel the invisible weight pressing down on both the vehicle and its driver. "And then there's the 219 pounds of unfulfilled dreams. That's the weight of the farm you wanted to buy in Montana. You've been saving money for 8 years, but you're too afraid to take the risk. That fear is literally weighing you down, making every mile harder than it should be." The 127 pounds of memories you're trying to forget include the accident you caused in Denver 5 years ago. Nobody died, but you remember the look on that family's faces when you ran the red light. You carry that with you every day, and it's affecting your ability to drive safely. Jake started backing toward his truck, desperate to escape this impossible conversation that was revealing truths he had never shared with anyone. "This is insane," he protested. "You can't weigh memories, you can't measure guilt." But as he spoke, Jake felt something he'd never experienced before. A literal heaviness in his chest, as if his emotions were physical objects pressing down on him with tangible weight. The officer held up his hand to stop Jake from leaving, his expression grave and final. "I'm afraid I can't let you continue with this load, Mr. Sullivan. You're over the legal limit for psychological cargo. You need to unload some of this weight before you can proceed safely down the highway." Let's dive into the next disturbing story. It was 11:30 at night on a Thursday, and Danny desperately needed his mandatory 10-hour break after pushing hard through multiple states. The rest stop looked typical enough in the pale glow of the security lights, with a few weathered picnic tables, humming vending machines, and a small brick building housing the restrooms. What caught Danny's attention, though, was that he wasn't alone in the otherwise empty facility. Danny thought nothing of it at first, as plenty of people pulled over for a quick nap during long drives, especially in the late hours when fatigue could turn deadly. He backed his rig into a spot about 50 yards away, set his alarm for 9:30 in the morning, and settled into his sleeper cab for what he hoped would be a restful night. As Danny walked toward the restroom building, his footsteps echoing in the still air, he noticed something odd that made his skin crawl with unease. The person in the pickup truck hadn't moved, not even an inch. They were sitting in exactly the same position as before, head tilted back against the headrest, arms hanging at their sides in perfect stillness. The sight bothered Danny more than it should have, creating a knot of anxiety in his stomach that he couldn't explain. After using the restroom, Danny walked a bit closer to the pickup, telling himself he was just checking to make sure the driver was okay. That's when he saw something that made his blood run cold with terror. The driver's eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead through the windshield without blinking. Not moving, just staring into the darkness with an expression that Danny would later describe as completely blank, like nobody was home inside that motionless shell of a human being. Danny called out, trying to break through whatever trance had seized the driver. "Hey, you all right over there?" His voice echoed across the empty parking lot, but received no response. He tried again, louder this time, but the figure in the truck remained perfectly still, as if carved from stone. The dashboard lights were on, and he could hear the soft hum of the motor, a steady idle that suggested the vehicle was in perfect working order. Why would someone leave their engine running if they were unconscious or worse? And why were their eyes open, staring with such terrifying intensity into the empty night? Instead of calling emergency services immediately, Danny decided to get a closer look, drawn by a morbid curiosity that he would later regret. As he approached the driver's side window, the man's head suddenly turned toward him in a movement that was neither quick nor natural, but rather a slow mechanical rotation that seemed to take forever. When their eyes met, Danny felt his knees nearly buckle with fear. The man's face was completely expressionless, but his eyes seemed to be looking through Danny rather than at him, as if seeing something far beyond the physical world. Danny asked through the glass, his voice cracking with nervous energy. The man's mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. His lips moved as if he was trying to speak, desperately attempting to communicate some vital message, but Danny couldn't hear anything except the steady hum of the engine and the sound of his own heart pounding in his chest. Danny could see that the man's hand was shaking violently, trembling with fear or some other intense emotion, though the rest of his body remained perfectly still like a statue. That's when Danny noticed the smell that would haunt his dreams for years to come. Even through the closed windows of the pickup, there was an overwhelming odor of something sweet and chemical, like industrial cleaner mixed with something organic and rotten, a combination that made his eyes water and his stomach lurch with revulsion. Somewhere between Sterling and the Nebraska border, on a stretch of Interstate 76 that seemed to go on forever under a star-filled sky, Tom was fighting to stay awake, his eyelids heavy with fatigue, when his CB radio crackled to life with what sounded like a normal trucker conversation that would soon reveal itself to be anything but normal. "Eastbound Kenworth, you got your ears on." The voice was clear and professional, with the kind of calm tone that experienced drivers used during routine check-ins on the highway. Tom glanced at his mirrors, searching for headlights behind him, but didn't see any other vehicles. The highway was empty, except for his rig cutting through the darkness, creating a cone of light in an ocean of black prairie. "Yeah, I copy you, driver. This is the Blue Pete heading toward Denver." The second voice was different, younger with a slight southern accent that carried the easy familiarity of someone who had been on the road for years. Tom looked ahead through his windshield, scanning for taillights, but saw no other trucks anywhere on the road. The highway stretched endlessly in both directions, empty and desolate under the vast Colorado sky. He keyed his microphone, curious about these phantom conversations. "This is Big Tom in the red Freightliner. Where you boys at? I don't see anybody else out here." His words hung in the air for several minutes, met only by silence and static, as if his transmission had been swallowed by the emptiness around him. They were discussing weather conditions, road construction, and dot checkpoints in the familiar cadence of professional drivers sharing information. But something about their conversation felt fundamentally wrong, like listening to an echo from another time. They mentioned construction on Interstate 80 in Iowa that Tom knew had been completed months ago. They talked about a way station in Kansas that had been permanently closed the previous year due to budget cuts. Tom tried breaking in again, his voice more urgent this time. "That's been done since last fall. The road's been clear for months now." But again, no response came. The voices continued their outdated conversation, discussing road conditions and detours for construction projects that no longer existed, sharing information that had been accurate years ago but was now obsolete. It was as if he was listening to a recording of a conversation from the past, somehow bleeding through into the present on Channel 19. The conversation was looping, repeating itself with mechanical precision. Every 23 minutes, it would start over with the exact same exchange. "Eastbound Kenworth, you got your ears on." Then the same responses, the same weather reports, the same outdated road information delivered in the same inflections and timing. Tom timed it carefully with his watch, and the loop was precise to the second, like a broken record playing the same song over and over again. When Tom stopped at a truck stop outside Big Springs, Nebraska, he asked the night clerk about CB radio interference in the area, hoping for some rational explanation for what he had experienced. The clerk, a thin man with tired eyes and the pale complexion of someone who worked nights, gave Tom a strange look that suggested he had heard this question before. "You heard them too, huh?" he said, leaning across the counter and lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "Happens about once a month. Always the same two guys, always talking about roads that ain't been torn up in years. Been going on for about 2 years now, ever since that accident." The clerk explained that several truckers had reported the same phenomenon over the past few years. The voices always appeared on Channel 19 between midnight and 4 in the morning, always in the same stretch of highway between Sterling and Big Springs. Local ham radio operators had tried to triangulate the signal using sophisticated equipment, but it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, defying the basic laws of radio transmission. The FCC had investigated but found no unauthorized transmitters in the area, no technical explanation for how these voices could appear on the airwaves. "The thing is," the clerk continued, his voice dropping even lower, "we looked into those construction projects they're always talking about, found some old DOT records and trucker forums from years back. 2 drivers were discussing those exact same road conditions back in early 2016. Names were Jake Morrison and Eddie Valdez. Both of them died that winter in a car accident on Interstate 76, right around mile marker 165, black ice in the middle of the night. Jake was in a blue Peterbilt. Eddie was driving a Kenworth head-on collision during that big storm we had in February 2016. Both trucks went off the road and down an embankment. According to the accident report, they were talking on their CBS right up until the crash, trying to warn each other about the dangerous road conditions that ultimately claimed their lives. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. Rick Dawson thought he was getting the easiest job of his trucking career when dispatch called him at 3 o'clock in the morning with an emergency run. The load was already prepped and waiting at a warehouse outside Bakersfield, California, with instructions to pick it up and deliver it to a distribution center in Phoenix by noon the next day. Simple enough, Rick thought, until he arrived at the pickup location and discovered that nothing about this job would be simple or explicable by any rational understanding of how the shipping industry operates. The warehouse sat alone on an industrial road that seemed to lead nowhere, surrounded by empty lots and rusted chain-link fencing that spoke of abandonment and decay. No company signs identified the facility. No loading dock numbers provided organization. Just a plain metal building with a single overhead door that was already open when Rick arrived. Rick had been driving for 8 years and had picked up loads from hundreds of warehouses across the country. But he'd never seen one this bare bones and isolated, stripped of all the normal markers of legitimate business operations. A forklift operator waved Rick over to back up to the dock, but the man was wearing coveralls with no company logo and a baseball cap, pulled low over his face to obscure his features. When Rick tried to make small talk while the trailer was being loaded, asking about the company and the cargo, the operator just grunted and avoided eye contact, working with mechanical efficiency that suggested he wanted to complete the transaction as quickly as possible. Rick asked for the bill of lading and manifest, standard paperwork for any legitimate shipment, but the documents handed to him looked suspicious despite their official appearance. The company names were generic and unmemorable: Western Distribution and Southwest Logistics, with addresses that were just post office boxes rather than actual business locations. What bothered Rick most was the load itself, which, according to the paperwork, consisted of electronics, televisions, computers, and stereo equipment. But as the pallets were loaded into his trailer, Rick noticed they didn't sound right when the forklift set them down. Electronic shipments usually had a certain weight distribution and made specific sounds when moved, but these pallets thudded onto his trailer floor with a weight that seemed wrong, too heavy in some places and too light in others. The forklift operator finished loading and immediately disappeared back into the warehouse without securing Rick's trailer or checking the load distribution, leaving Rick to lock up his own trailer, which was unusual but not unheard of in his experience. As he pulled away from the dock, he caught a glimpse in his mirrors of the warehouse overhead door closing, and within minutes, the entire building was dark, as if no one had ever been there, as if the whole operation had been designed to vanish the moment he left. Rick started his drive toward Phoenix around 4:30 in the morning, planning to make the delivery with time to spare and perhaps even grab a decent meal along the way. But as he merged onto Interstate 5 and began climbing the grapevine, his truck started acting strange in ways that defied his understanding of vehicle mechanics. The engine was working harder than it should have been, and his fuel gauge was dropping faster than normal, as if he was hauling significantly more weight than his paperwork indicated. Rick checked his gross weight at the first scale he passed, and the reading showed 78,000 pounds, just under the legal limit. But his truck was behaving like he was hauling 90,000 pounds or more, struggling with grades that should have been manageable and consuming fuel at a rate that didn't match the official weight. Around sunrise, Rick decided to pull over at a truck stop to check his load and try to understand why his vehicle was performing so poorly. What he found made his stomach drop with a mixture of fear and confusion that would haunt him for years. The trailer doors were sealed with a type of security tape he'd never seen before, thick metallic strips that looked more like evidence tape than standard shipping seals. More disturbing was that the seal numbers didn't match what was written on his bill of lading, suggesting that someone had changed the seals after the paperwork was completed. Rick called his dispatcher to report the discrepancy, expecting a simple explanation and instructions for how to proceed. But the dispatcher sounded confused and asked Rick to repeat the pickup location, as if he had never heard of it before. After a few minutes on hold, the dispatcher came back with news that made Rick's blood run cold with disbelief. "Rick, we don't have any record of that pickup. The load you're describing isn't in our system, and that warehouse address you gave me, it doesn't exist in any of our databases." Rick pulled out his GPS and entered the warehouse address from his paperwork, but the device responded with a message he had never seen before: "Location not found." He tried the company names from the bill of lading, searching for any trace of Western Distribution or Southwest Logistics, but found nothing. It was as if the entire pickup had been erased from existence, except for the 78,000 pounds of mystery cargo sitting in his trailer, defying explanation and challenging everything he thought he understood about the logistics industry he had worked in for nearly a decade. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. Carl Henderson was running dangerously low on fuel when he spotted the truck stop off Highway 50 in Nevada. It was 2:30 in the morning on a Tuesday in August 2020, and Carl had been driving through the desert for hours without seeing a single service station, watching his fuel gauge creep steadily toward empty with growing anxiety. His truck's computer was warning him he had maybe 40 miles left before running dry, and the Nevada desert at night was no place to be stranded with an empty tank. The truck stop appeared like a mirage in his headlights, a standard pilot travel center with the familiar red and blue sign well-lit fuel islands, and what looked like a busy parking lot full of other trucks. Carl felt a wave of relief wash over him as he pulled off the highway, grateful for this perfectly timed salvation. Running out of fuel in the Nevada desert at night was every trucker's nightmare, a potentially deadly situation that could leave a driver stranded for hours or even days in temperatures that could kill. As Carl maneuvered his rig toward the diesel pumps, he noticed something that seemed slightly off, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what was bothering him. The truck stop looked modern and well-maintained, but all the other trucks in the lot appeared to be older models, mostly rigs from the 1990s and early 2000s. Carl had been driving for 23 years and could identify truck models by their headlight patterns and body styles, but he didn't see a single truck that looked newer than maybe 2005, as if he had somehow driven back in time. Carl pulled up to pump number 7 and climbed down from his cab, expecting a routine fueling stop that would get him back on the road within minutes. The fuel island looked normal enough, with standard diesel pumps featuring the familiar credit card readers and display screens. But when Carl tried to insert his fuel card, the reader showed an error message he'd never seen before. Authorization system offline. See attendant for service. That's when Carl realized he hadn't seen a single person since arriving at the truck stop, despite the lot being full of vehicles. The truck stop was completely devoid of human activity. There were no drivers walking around, no one fueling up, no conversations or CB chatter that you'd normally hear at a busy truck stop. Even the store windows were lit up and appeared to be stocked with merchandise, but Carl couldn't see anyone inside. The silence was absolute and unnerving, broken only by the hum of electrical equipment and the distant sound of wind across the desert. It was as if everyone had simply vanished, leaving behind their trucks and an operational facility that ran itself. Carl walked toward the main building, looking for an attendant or cashier who could help him with the fuel authorization problem. The automatic doors opened normally, and he stepped into what appeared to be a typical truck stop convenience store. The shelves were fully stocked with snacks, drinks, and trucking supplies. The hot food counter had fresh coffee brewing and what looked like recently prepared sandwiches under heat lamps, steam still rising from the warming trays. But there was no one behind the counter, no customers browsing the aisles, no sounds of activity from anywhere in the building. "Hello," Carl called out, his voice echoing strangely in the empty store, as if the building was much larger inside than it appeared from outside. The sound seemed to travel further than it should have, bouncing off walls he couldn't see and returning to him distorted and hollow. "Anybody here?" No response came, just the echo of his own voice fading into silence. Carl walked through the store, checking the restrooms, the driver's lounge, even the shower facilities. Everything was clean and functional, but completely abandoned, as if the staff had simply walked away mid-shift and never returned. Carl tried the cash register, thinking maybe it was a self-service situation during overnight hours. The screen was active and showing a normal point-of-sale interface, but when he tried to process a fuel transaction, it asked for an employee code that he obviously didn't have. Carl went back outside to try the fuel pumps again, hoping the authorization system had come back online, but the error message persisted. That's when Carl noticed something that made his skin crawl with unease. All the trucks in the parking lot had their engines off, but their parking lights were on, creating an eerie constellation of red and amber lights in the darkness. Every single truck was positioned perfectly in its parking space, as if they had all been carefully arranged rather than randomly parked by individual drivers, who had arrived at different times and for different purposes. The precision of their positioning was unsettling, too perfect to be natural, suggesting some kind of deliberate organization that served a purpose Carl couldn't understand. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. Mike Henderson had been driving 18-wheelers for over 15 years when he encountered something on Interstate 80 that still haunts him to this day. What started as a routine haul from Chicago to Sacramento in the winter of 2019 turned into a psychological nightmare that left him questioning everything he thought he knew about life on the road and the hidden dangers that lurk in the spaces between truck stops and rest areas. It was around 2 o'clock in the morning on a Tuesday night when Mike first noticed the car, somewhere in the middle of Nebraska, on a stretch of highway that seemed to go on forever under a moonless sky. The snow had been falling steadily for hours, creating a hypnotic curtain in his headlights that made the world beyond his windshield seem unreal and dreamlike. That's when he saw it in his mirrors. A dark sedan maintaining the exact same speed about a quarter mile behind him, following with mechanical precision that immediately set off alarm bells in his experienced mind. At first, Mike didn't think much of it, as plenty of drivers preferred to follow trucks through bad weather, using the semi's taillights as a guide and letting the bigger vehicle break through the worst of the wind and snow. It was a common practice that made sense in dangerous conditions, and Mike had seen it countless times over his years on the road. But as the hours passed, something began to feel fundamentally wrong about this particular follower, something that violated his understanding of normal driving behavior. The car never got closer, never fell back, never changed lanes to pass or adjust its position for better visibility. It just stayed there, perfectly positioned like a shadow attached to his rig, maintaining that precise distance with an unwavering consistency that defied human capability. Mike tried speeding up, watching his speedometer climb to 70, then 75 miles per hour, faster than he should have been driving in those treacherous conditions. The car matched his speed exactly, without any delay or adjustment period. He slowed down to 55, then 50 miles per hour, testing whether the car was actually following him or just coincidentally traveling at the same speed. The car slowed to maintaining that same precise distance, as if it was connected to his truck by an invisible tether. When Mike took the next exit to grab coffee and check his logbook, he watched in his mirrors as the car drove past the off-ramp without stopping, disappearing into the snowy darkness ahead as if it had never been there at all. Relief washed over him as he sat in the truck stop diner, warming his hands around a steaming cup of coffee and convincing himself it had been a coincidence, just another driver heading west who happened to be going the same speed. The familiar warmth and normalcy of the truck stop helped calm his nerves and restore his faith in rational explanations. But when Mike pulled back onto the interstate an hour later, his blood ran cold with terror. There it was again, exactly where it had been before, sitting in his mirrors like it had never left, as if it had been waiting patiently for his return. The next few hours became a test of Mike's sanity that pushed him to the breaking point. He tried every trick he knew to lose or identify his mysterious follower. Sudden lane changes, varying his speed dramatically, taking different routes through construction zones. Nothing worked. The car anticipated every move he made, staying locked in that same position behind him with an intelligence that seemed almost supernatural. What made it worse was that Mike could never get a clear look at the driver. The car's headlights created a glare in his mirrors that obscured details, and whenever he tried to adjust them for a better view, the angle never seemed right, as if the laws of physics were conspiring to keep the driver's identity hidden. All he could make out was a dark silhouette behind the wheel, motionless and eerily still, like a mannequin or a corpse propped up in the driver's seat. As dawn broke over Wyoming, Mike decided to make one final test that would either prove his sanity or confirm his worst fears. He took an exit for a small town called Pine Ridge, barely more than a truck stop, and a few houses scattered along the highway. He parked at the far end of an empty lot and waited, engine running, watching the entrance with growing anxiety. 5 minutes passed, then 10, then 15. Just as Mike began to think he'd finally lost his mysterious follower, the dark sedan appeared at the lot entrance. It didn't pull in or park. It just sat there at the edge of the road, waiting with the patience of something that had all the time in the world and nowhere else to be. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. Bobby Chen had been driving for Midwest Freight Lines for 6 years when he started getting calls from the night shift dispatcher, who didn't exist. It began on a rainy Thursday night in October 2021, somewhere between Kansas City and St. Louis on Interstate 70, when Bobby was running behind schedule due to weather delays that had plagued him since leaving the terminal. Bobby was fighting to stay awake on a stretch of highway that seemed to go on forever when his Qualcomm unit beeped with an incoming message at 2-40-7 in the morning. The message was from Dispatcher 7, a designation Bobby had never seen before in all his years with the company. All the dispatchers at Midwest Freight used their real names in the system. Sarah, Mike, Janet, and Tom covered the various shifts with professional familiarity. There was no Dispatcher 7, and Bobby had never heard of anyone using just a number instead of their name, which violated company policy and basic human courtesy that the firm prided itself on maintaining. Driver 421, this is dispatch. Take exit 89 for alternate route. Construction ahead will delay you 3 hours. Acknowledge. Bobby checked his GPS and his trucking atlas with growing confusion. Exit 89 was coming up in about 5 miles, but according to his information, it led to a small farm road that didn't connect to any major highways. There was no alternate route through that exit, no way to reach his destination except by continuing on Interstate 70 as originally planned. Bobby keyed his microphone to respond via the Qualcomm system, his voice tight with confusion and concern. Dispatch, this is Bobby Chen, truck 421. Can you confirm that route? Exit 89 doesn't show any through roads on my map. The response came back immediately, faster than any human dispatcher could have typed, as if the message had been prepared in advance. Driver Chen, trust, dispatch. Take exit 89. Time is critical. Lives depend on your compliance. The phrase, lives depend on your compliance, sent a chill down Bobby's spine that had nothing to do with the rain-soaked night outside his cab. In 6 years of trucking, he'd never heard a dispatcher use language like that, so formal and threatening, so unlike the casual professionalism that characterized normal communications. Bobby tried calling the main dispatch number on his phone, but it went straight to voicemail, which was unusual for a 24-hour operation that always had someone on duty to handle emergencies and routing changes. Bobby decided to trust his experience over the mysterious message, staying on Interstate 70 and figuring he'd deal with whatever construction delays lay ahead. But 20 minutes later, his Qualcomm beeped again with a message that made his hands shake with fear. Driver 421, you missed your exit. This is your final warning. Turn around immediately and take exit 89. Failure to comply will result in immediate termination and forfeiture of all benefits. Bobby had never been threatened like this by any dispatcher in his career. Company policy was strict but professional, focused on safety and efficiency rather than intimidation. They didn't make threats about termination over routing decisions, especially not in the middle of the night when clear thinking was already compromised by fatigue and stress. Bobby tried the main dispatch number again, and this time someone answered, but the voice wasn't one he recognized from years of regular contact. Midwest Freight Lines Night Dispatch, the voice said, but then trailed off as if the person had forgotten their own name or the purpose of their job. How can I help you? The voice sounded strained and exhausted, like someone who had been working far too long without rest, speaking with the mechanical precision of someone reading from a script they didn't understand. This is Bobby Chen, Truck 421, he said. I'm getting strange routing instructions from someone calling themselves Dispatcher 7. Can you verify this route? There was a long pause, filled with static and the sound of papers rustling. Then the voice returned with confusion that seemed genuine and terrifying. Dispatcher 7. I don't know about any Dispatcher 7. I'm the only one here tonight. I've been the only one here for another pause. As if the person was struggling to remember basic facts about their own existence. How long have I been here? Bobby felt his hands tighten on the steering wheel as fear crept up his spine. Who is this? He asked. What's your name? But the line had gone dead, leaving him alone with questions that had no answers and a growing certainty that something fundamental about his reality had shifted in ways he couldn't understand. Let's dive into the next disturbing story. Marcus Webb had driven the road from Dallas to Denver hundreds of times over his 15-year career. But on that foggy October night in 2019, something went terribly wrong. What should have been a straightforward run up Interstate 35 through Oklahoma turned into a nightmare that Marcus still can't fully explain to this day. A journey that challenged everything he thought he understood about the nature of highways and the destinations they're supposed to lead to. The trouble started around 11 o'clock in the evening, somewhere north of Oklahoma City. When Marcus had been driving in thick fog for about an hour, with visibility down to maybe 50 feet, he was following his GPS religiously, staying in the right lane at a steady 45 miles per hour, when his navigation system suddenly announced recalculating route and directed him to take the next exit. Marcus found this odd, since he'd driven this exact route dozens of times and had never needed to exit there before. But GPS systems got updated all the time with new traffic information. He followed the directions, taking exit 126 onto what appeared to be a state highway heading northwest. The road looked legitimate enough, with 2 lanes in each direction, proper lane markings, and standard highway signs that gave no indication anything was amiss. What bothered Marcus was that he couldn't remember ever seeing this exit before, despite having passed this way countless times. The fog made everything look different and unfamiliar, but he had an excellent memory for routes and landmarks that had served him well throughout his career. For the first 20 minutes, everything seemed normal enough. The GPS showed him making progress toward Denver, following a route that curved through what appeared to be rural Oklahoma farmland. But as Marcus continued driving, he began to notice inconsistencies that made his stomach tighten with unease and growing confusion. The mile markers were wrong, displaying numbers that didn't follow any logical sequence. He'd see marker 47, then 23, then 61, as if the highway department had installed them randomly without any regard for proper numbering systems. Even more disturbing, some of the markers appeared to be handmade, consisting of rough wooden posts with spray-painted numbers that looked nothing like official Department of Transportation signage. Marcus tried his CB radio to check in with other drivers, hoping to get some clarification about his location. But all he got was static that seemed unusually thick and persistent. His cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual in rural areas, but combined with everything else, it added to his growing anxiety about his situation. He decided to pull over at the next truck stop or rest area to get his bearings and perhaps call dispatch for guidance. But despite driving for over an hour on what appeared to be a major highway, he hadn't seen a single service station, restaurant, or even a rest area. The road continued endlessly through the fog without any of the commercial infrastructure that typically lined major transportation routes, as if he was driving through a void that existed between the normal world and somewhere else entirely. That's when Marcus noticed the other vehicles on the road with him, and what he saw made his blood run cold with recognition and terror. There were cars and trucks sharing the highway, but something about them felt fundamentally wrong in ways he couldn't immediately articulate. They all seemed to be older models, nothing newer than maybe 2010, and they maintained perfect spacing, as if they were all following some predetermined pattern that had been programmed into their movements. No one was passing anyone else. No one was changing lanes. And Marcus never saw anyone enter or exit the highway. The vehicles moved in perfect synchronization, like pieces in some vast mechanical clockwork, driven by people who seemed to have no will of their own. Marcus tried to pass a slow-moving sedan that had been in front of him for miles, hoping to get a better look at what was happening around him. As he pulled into the left lane and drew alongside the car, he glanced over at the driver, and what he saw made his hands clench the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white with strain. The driver was staring straight ahead with an expression of absolute terror, eyes wide with fear, mouth slightly open in what might have been a silent scream, gripping the steering wheel like his life depended on maintaining control of a vehicle that might no longer be under his command. When the driver noticed Marcus looking, he turned his head slowly and mouthed a single word that Marcus would never forget: "Help." Marcus honked his horn and tried to gesture for the driver to pull over, desperate to offer assistance, or at least make contact with another human being in this nightmare landscape. But the man just shook his head frantically and pointed ahead as if he couldn't stop, as if some invisible force was compelling him to continue driving forward into the endless fog that seemed to swallow everything that entered it.